I'm Bob Riggio. With me is Lee Boyles, another one of our many veterans that we have located throughout the Black Hills area. And again, this is how we like to recognize and thank our veterans. All right, Lee, let's start off. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, basically, I was in the Air Force for 3.5 years, and then I went to work for Northwestern Bell and worked for them for 31 years.
Before you went into the Air Force?
I graduated from high school in '64.
Okay. Yeah,
out in Pasadena, and then went to work for the Forest Service as a firefighter for a year, and then I got my draft notice.
You were drafted. What year? This had to be back in the 60s when the draft was in effect.
65. And I got my draft notice, and I decided that my chances of surviving Vietnam were better in the Air Force than in the Army. So I joined the Air Force and went through basic training in Lackland in Texas, and then
Same here.
I was a heavy equipment operator in the Air Force, so they sent me up to Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas for tech school.
Yeah, you said you had 3 options, though. You had 3 options. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I went through, when you'd go through with your recruiter and everything, you take I think they were called ASVAB tests or something similar to that, but it was, see what you're good at.
Okay.
And I came out high in mechanical and electronics and electrical. So then when they said, what job openings do you have? They said, well, they had security police.
Okay.
They needed cooks, and they needed heavy equipment operators. And I asked the recruiter, I said, what does this have to do with those tests? And he kind of chuckled, and he says, that's what we need right now.
So you had to pick one of the 3.
You
had no other choice.
I had to pick one of the 3. I wasn't really into law enforcement or security. I like to eat, obviously, but I didn't think I'd be a very good cook, so that's what I did, went in as heavy equipment operator.
And heavy equipment operator that sent you off to tech school. Where was that located?
Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas.
And what was involved with that?
Well, you did a lot of textbook work on safety and operation of the equipment. Then you actually got to go out and do hands-on in the field and running everything from bulldozers to cranes to graders and front-end loaders. One of the interesting parts of that job title is that it also covers railroads. On the bases that have railroad spurs in them, that have GIs that are running the trains and moving the cars around, that's the career field. The heavy equipment career field is the one that operates the engines. So we actually got to learn to operate a diesel locomotive, and the part of our training was to move some cars around on a siding and stuff. So that's the one and only time I've ever been in a train engine, which was kind of an interesting.
And then you're notified you have a TDY. It's overseas. Tell the folks where.
Vietnam.
Okay.
And I was over there for 6 months. We started off, we were in Ben Thuy Air Base in the Mekong Delta, and it was a Vietnamese Air Force base.
Okay.
And they had fighters and all prop planes, no jets, all prop planes. But they had bombs hanging under them and so forth, and they were sitting out on the airfield. Well, if one plane blew up from a rocket or whatever, it would take the rest of the aircraft with it. So they built what they called revetments. They were big, it was kind of like a giant erector set. They were hollow, they were 6 foot wide and hollow, and you built them in a big U shape around where each aircraft parked. Filled them with sand, and then they topped them with road tar to seal the sand up so the sand didn't blow around. And then every third one had a guard tower up on top of it with security folks in there.
And that's what you built? You built those barriers in between the aircraft?
We built the barriers in between the aircraft. We had Vietnamese nationals that were actually putting the bolts in and tightening the bolts down. The GIs were running the heavy equipment, bringing the material over to them and holding it in place while they slid it in and everything. And then we'd load the sand inside, which was another interesting sidelight. They bought the sand from a known Viet Cong. And when he came onto base, he had the military police for the Vietnamese side were called QCs or Quan Cons. And they'd have 2 of those folks riding with him. One guy was sitting with him with a pistol hanging on the running board right next to him as he's driving and sitting there with a pistol in his hand. And the other guy was sitting across from the old guy in the cab of the truck with a rifle laying across his hand. And they'd drive in, they'd dump the sand, and away they'd go. And I go, really, we're buying our sand for this? But that happened, yeah.
And then from there, Da Nang.
Went to Da Nang. Our next movement was up to Da Nang. We were doing the same thing. Same sort of thing. The part at Da Nang that really bothered me the most is our equipment storage area was next to the building where they processed the bodies, the mortuary. And you'd see the 6-bys coming from the weapons storage area with those big aluminum cases on them that they carried missiles and stuff in. And well, they used them multi-purpose because they'd bring them over to the morgue, and that's where they processed the bodies and loaded them in and took them out to the flight line to take them back. So that was kind of depressing. You sit there and you're doing the maintenance on your equipment and getting ready to go and stuff, and you see these trucks just steadily going in and out, in and out. It was pretty steady, yeah, it was pretty steady. And it was kind of depressing, but it is what it is, you know.
You experienced some incoming fire as well from the enemy.
We did. Each of the barracks that we lived in, the barracks at Da Nang, and each of the barracks had a bunker, big sandbag bunkers outside of them. And anytime, if you were in the barracks for your off time or whatever, or sleeping at night or daytime, depending on what shift you were on, and the warning sirens would go off, the first thing you did was just roll out of your bunk, get outside and get in the bunker. If you're in your skivvies, you're in your skivvies, but you get out in that bunker. And we had one time when one of the rockets hit down at the end of our building, and as the shrapnel blew up, it came through some of the windows and the sides of the building, and when we came back in, there was chunks of shrapnel laying on my bunk.
Oh, wow.
So, you know, who knows what would have happened, but I was glad that I'd gone out into the bunker at that time. So, you know, it was an interesting assignment, but I was glad to be back home when I was. You do your job, you try to do it the best you can, and if your time's up, your time's up.
That's what I hear from most veterans that had the enemy fire upon them. You focus on your job. That's the first thing you do. You focus on your job, getting that done. And like you're saying, if your time's up, your time's up.
At the time when I was discharged, all I wanted to do was get away from it. You know, I was tired of the whole regimen with the military, and as I look back on it, I would think that maybe if I'd have stayed in longer, I might have, you know, done more with it. I don't know.
You wanted to get away from it probably because how you were received when you got back home. That had to be a big part of
I
it.
had a family here in Duluth at the time, and I just wanted to spend more time with my family. And if you're in the military, you do a fair amount of traveling, depending on what job you have. I was pleased to be able to serve our country, and I would do it again if I was physically able to. And God bless America.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your service. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Appreciate you.